Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with a treasury of common sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
The national accounts for the March quarter were released yesterday. Now, at the same time, the RBA Governor, Michelle Bullock, was actually providing evidence to a parliamentary committee. And this is significant because it shows the state of the Australian economy at the moment and really gives hints to the direction of where we're going, what's going to happen with interest rates. Leith Van Onselen joins us from Macro Business. G'day, Leith.
G'day, Clinton. How are you?
I'm good, mate. A 0.1% increase in growth in GDP in the first quarter. It's a pretty slow economy, to say the least.
Yeah, mate, it was an absolute stinker. So the March quarter national accounts were released on Wednesday from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And as you just said, showed that overall GDP growth slumped to its lowest level since the early 1990s recession outside of the pandemic, which is 0.1% growth. So that's across the total economy. And that was worse than what economists and also the RBA had expected. So the RBA, in its latest statement of monetary policy, or its latest forecast, suggested that we're going to get 0.3% growth. Instead, we got 0.1, so it missed that by a fair way. But more importantly, for you and me and all the other listeners out there, the overall, whether or not the economy grows overall is one thing, and it's not really that important in my view. What really matters is what our slice of the pie is. So per capita GDP, so that's basically your GDP when you divide it by the strong population growth we've had, it actually fell by 0.4% in Q1. And that also was, that meant that it was down 1.3% over the year, and that also was the weakest GDP growth, per capita GDP growth since the early 90s recession. So it's a bit of a stinker. And what makes this even worse is that the economy has basically decelerated for 5 consecutive quarters. So, it's basically getting slower and slower over the last 5 quarters. So each quarter's been worse than the one before it. And if you actually take the 6-month annualised pace of GDP growth, it showed that the economy in total, so this is not in per capita terms, only grew by 0.8% annualised. So if you annualise the last 2 quarters, and that compares to population growth of 2.4%. So what that basically tells you is that the economy is contracting very quickly in per person terms, which is which is obviously what matters. So obviously the overall economic pie is still growing very modestly, but the average size of that slice of that pie that you and I get in, everyone else in Australia, is actually shrinking, and it's shrunk for 5 consecutive quarters. So it's a very, very deep per capita recession we're in. And the strange thing, you mentioned Michelle Bullock appearing at Senate estimates on Wednesday. Well, she was asked by one of the Liberal MPs, can't remember which one, about the per capita recession, and Michelle Bullock said that she didn't think it was very relevant, which, to be quite honest, I was flabbergasted by. I mean, I would like to live in a world, Clinton, where every time the ABS reports the national accounts and every time the media reports it, they report the GDP per capita number. They don't report the overall GDP because, to be quite frank, it's irrelevant. So, Australia could have a population growing by 5% a year, and sure, the economy is going to grow.
Yeah.
But what matters is what is happening to our standard of living. And all this release basically shows is that the economy is only being kept out of recession by, some of the strongest population growth in nearly 70 years. And, it's a ridiculous economic model we're growing. Just bring in, heaps of people. And yes, those people spend, they work in the economy, et cetera, and that keeps, the economy ticking over. But once you divide that growth over all the additional people, we're all going backwards. And, I thought it was a bit flippant of the RBA governor to, basically just fob it off and say, it doesn't really matter, because it does matter. It matters to all of us. And what this slowing economic data basically tells you, and it's been led by the household sector, and that's the thing that's most alarming, because you and I and everyone who's listening to this lives in the household sector. That's the sector that we care about. And real consumer spending has fallen for 5 consecutive quarters, which was also reflected in the latest retail sales, which are the weakest in 30 years and are crashing in per capita terms. And normally that sort of thing would be associated with, a large negative shock or recession, but, overall recession, but we're not getting that because of the high population growth. And also real household disposable income per capita also fell by 0.3% over the quarter. So our incomes are falling, and that's obviously down, and that's also down by 0.4% over the year. So this is basically a consumer-led per capita recession that we've got, and it's hitting households the hardest, and that's the reason that the economy is basically in this hole. And it also, what it basically means is that the unemployment rate's going to keep rising because GDP tends to lead employment, and that means unemployment. So it means that we're going to keep getting rising unemployment for the rest of the year, which means we're going to have lower wage growth. And wages are already down significantly in real terms once you adjust out inflation. They've collapsed to about 2010 levels, and we're likely to get further falls from here. And this basically just paints a picture of a really sick economy here where per person living standards, which is what matters, is really deep in the red here. And unfortunately, what it means, it doesn't mean a lot for interest rates at this stage because while the economy is weakening faster than the Reserve Bank expected, unfortunately, inflation's a little higher than they expected. So it's got this tug of war going where they're trying to balance two things. They're trying to balance, obviously, the inflation side of the equation, which is a little bit worse than what they want, with the economy that's worse than what they want.
And Michelle Bullock was Michelle Bullock was effectively saying before Senate estimates yesterday that inflation hurts Australians more than interest rate increases. Yeah,
I mean, look, she might be right in aggregate, but unfortunately, the damage from those interest rate increases is worse for the people that are affected by them. So, unfortunately, interest rates only really impact about 1/3 of the population. So they're effectively the 1/3 of the population that has owner-occupier mortgages. So effectively, we're clubbing, 1/3 of Australia to try and get inflation down, and it doesn't impact the other 2/3 directly.
Yeah.
Whereas obviously inflation affects everyone. So yeah, she has a point, but it just sort of shows you that unfortunately, the Reserve Bank's got one tool, which is interest rates, which is a really blunt tool that only impacts 1/3 of the economy, and 1/3 of households. It smashes the hell out of them to try and get inflation down. It's very unfair in a lot of ways to try and cool the economy on behalf of everyone. Whereas what we really need is we need the federal government to step in and to take action directly to lower inflation. The best way to do it would be to simply cut immigration, to be quite frank, because one of the reasons why we've got this stubbornly high inflation is because we've got excessive immigration, which is pushing up housing inflation and things like that, and feeding directly into the CPI. And on top of that, we also need the federal government to take action on the energy market to deliver us cheap energy because, as I think I've said to you previously, East Coast Australia pays some of the highest gas and electricity prices in the world, despite the fact that we export oodles of gas and we export oodles of coal, and we're an energy superpower. And it's kind of akin to, a Middle Eastern country paying $2 a litre for petrol when they sell 80% of their oil or more. Probably in the case of Saudi Arabia, it's more like 99%. But they sell most of their oil offshore, but then domestically you're paying $2 a litre like we do in Melbourne and Sydney, which makes no sense. But that's effectively what Australia's doing with our energy. We are a major gas exporter, one of the very biggest in the world. We've got oodles of the stuff. But then, for some reason, we sell that to China cheaper than what we pay at home. And these foreign-owned corporations basically gouge us. And we're paying, European-style prices for our energy, even though we export it all. It just doesn't make any sense. And that's one of the reasons why we've got inflation, because expensive energy feeds into everything.
Are we in this economic state, and I guess protected, the figures are looking better because of, as you've explained for weeks on this segment, because of migration, but are we in this state because of the 13 interest rate increases in a row, which is the intention to slow down the economy?
Yeah. Well, certainly, definitely interest rates is a very strong cyclical measure. So, obviously if you ramp them up really quickly, you're going to hammer the economy pretty hard, and that's what we've done. But there are also structural problems we've got. So we're basically a very low productivity economy now, and Canada, which is running this very similar economic model here, is in a similar state. So we've basically had 20 years where Australia has grown its population a lot faster than we've grown business investment, infrastructure and housing. And as a result, that means that you get what's economists call capital shallowing. So you've got less capital per person, and then that damages your productivity. And that's sort of more a long-term cyclical problem Australia's got. But certainly, in terms of where we are in the short run, definitely this 13 interest rate hikes have smashed us. And although Australia hasn't hiked interest rates as much as, say, the US or even Canada or New Zealand, it actually impacts Australians a lot more because we have, one of the world's highest shares of variable rate mortgages. So, for example, in the US, about 15% of their mortgages are variable rate. In Australia, it's about 85%.
Yeah,
So,
they're on fixed rates. A lot.
yeah, so as a result, the interest rate hikes in Australia have hit mortgage holders almost instantly, whereas in the US, it barely impacts them at all because most people are on these 30-year fixed rates. And other countries like New Zealand are on, majority of fixed rates, but they're for shorter periods. But even so, they're not impacted as much as we are. So, unfortunately, yes, to answer your question in a very long and sort of twisted way, certainly I think monetary policy's obviously very tight, and that's having a direct impact. And for that reason, I just can't see there as a bank hiking interest rates again. I still think the next move is going to be down, but they just need the economic data to weaken a bit more, so the unemployment rate to tick up, which it will do, and as well as obviously those inflation pressures to come down, which I think it will do as well once wage growth falls and things like that. So we'll get there, but it's obviously been a long and drawn out, painful process. That just seems to be it's like pulling teeth. It's just taking longer than what I certainly hope for.
Yeah, Michelle Bullock made it pretty clear before Parliament yesterday that the rates need to be below that 3%. It's not just 3%, it needs to be below 3%. The target's 2 to 3%. Hey, always good to talk to you, Leith. We'll talk again next week.
Yeah, thanks, Clinton. Speak to you next time.
Leith Van Alselen from Macro Business.